Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife made their first court appearance in New York days after their dramatic capture by U.S. forces. Good evening, I'm Brennan Gurley. Today, Maduro declared through an interpreter, quote, "I'm innocent, I am not guilty, I'm a decent man," and insisting he is still the constitutional president of Venezuela. Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, pleaded not guilty to 4 federal charges, including conspiracy to import cocaine and machine guns, and conspiracy to commit narco-terrorism. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of demonstrators gathered, some opposing U.S. action in Venezuela, others celebrating Maduro's removal.
The law is clear that the manner in which a defendant is brought before a court does not strip the court of its power to try the defendant. The judge is not going to let Maduro go free because the arrest involved cruise missiles.
Legal experts say while the legality of Maduro's capture may be debated in Congress and at the United Nations, it is unlikely to affect the court's authority. Maduro and his wife agreed to remain in custody, though his attorney has hinted at a future bail request. Right now, swift reaction is continuing to pour in following Maduro and his wife's capture. But the question again remains, what happens next? So joining us to help break down this is Dr. John Barrett, a political science professor at LeTourneau University. Dr. Barrett, always good to see you. Well, first, Dr. Barrett, we have a lot to unpack here. Americans waking up yesterday morning to that surprise news. The president says the U.S. will run the country for now in Venezuela. Can the U.S. legally run Venezuela?
Well, the question is not so much can the U.S. legally run Venezuela. It's more of a question of the military and the political situation. And that's to say it's going to be very, very difficult because without boots on the ground, people that are there to actually enforce your will, it's very difficult to get the existing regime to do what you want it to do. So we'll see what kind of carrot and sticks that the administration tries to put into play here, but it's going to be tricky to get the regime to really bend to the U.S. will.
Dr. Barrett, the legal authority for the strike wasn't really immediately clear, and reports actually note that they didn't know if Congress was consulted in this beforehand. So from a constitutional and also just an international law standpoint, can a U.S. president order such an operation?
Well, again, it's really not a question of legality. You know, for example, the Korean War was technically an illegal war that the Congress never authorized. And so it's really a political question of how important is it to obtain authorization? What is the Congress going to do if it's not asked for its approval? And I think the politics here, you know, the Congress seems to be willing to go along with whatever Trump has been doing so far. Now, we have to see where it goes from here. Again, if there's more strikes, if there's talk of actually deploying troops into Venezuela, that may kind of shift the political winds. But right now, the legal question isn't having a big impact.
And the Monroe Doctrine is also nearly 200 years old, but it's suddenly kind of front and center again through all of this. Can you explain, Dr. Barrett, why the doctrine is being invoked now and how it shapes U.S. claims of authority or even influence in Latin America?
Well, the Monroe Doctrine has, for a long time, you know, stipulated that the U.S. will have the interest in Latin America, and, you know, other powers should stay out. But what we're seeing here is a much more beefy kind of interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine than we've ever seen. And so, again, there's a lot of questions about where do we go from here? Is this a new U.S. policy where the U.S. is going to be very aggressive in trying to get the various countries in the region to, again, bend to its will and behave the way that it wants it to behave? You know, there's already been questions about what about Cuba or even Greenland or other, you know, areas in the hemisphere that, you know, Trump has made clear that he would like to see some changes there. So we'll have to see what happens moving forward.
And let's talk about what's happening right now. The president has said the current vice president of Venezuela can stay as long as she does what they say. What do you expect to happen now when it comes to ruling Venezuela, and how much of an impact can the U.S. have there?
Well, again, it's very difficult to enforce your will without boots on the ground. You know, this was a very impressive, very daring operation, most likely pulled off with some cooperation from people inside of the Venezuelan regime. but it's going to be very hard to replicate that. And so if the vice president of Venezuela is proving to be uncooperative, it's going to be much more difficult to do this again. And it's like, okay, even if you could do it a second time, how many times are you going to try to repeat this trick? And at some point, again, if you don't actually have troops inside Venezuela, it's very difficult to get the regime to do what you want it to do.
And continuing with that theme, Dr. Barrett, about boots on the ground and given the initial scale of the initial operation, do you think the U.S. is preparing for any additional military action?
Well, I don't know. There's certainly, a lot of insinuations that this isn't the only card that we're willing to play. And so you've got to believe that the military has some plans on the shelf for follow-up operations, but it's a question, again, of how deeply do we want to get involved. It's one thing to pull off a raid like this, as impressive as it is. It's going to be a much deeper level of commitment to actually start deploying troops there, because then the possibilities for U.S. casualties goes up dramatically.
All righty, Dr. John Barrett, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.